2011 for his thesis titled India's Military Strategy, the first such research thesis on this topic in Japan. I welcome all the guests and all the panelists. And we are thankful for your esteemed presence in this panel. Now, I would request Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, sir, to take the discussions ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Sundar, if I got your name right, for that introduction to this evening's webinar. And let me begin by saying that it's a real pleasure for all of us here to participate in this webinar, primarily because of the importance that I attach, not just to the topic, but to the task of reaching out to young minds, and especially students who are in various universities around the country. We today live in an age when it's virtually impossible to disaggregate what is happening on the external front from what is happening within the country. And these policies are inextricably linked as well. And so I think it's our duty as well to reach out and interact with the youth in India so that they are apprised of and sensitized to various strategic matters. For after all, the world that lies ahead is the one that they will inherit far more than what we will inherit as the previous generation. At least some of us. I can see youthful faces among the panelists as well. So this is something that I personally attach importance to, and I therefore think it's our great privilege and pleasure to be here with you. It's the quality that matters, the fact that we are reaching out to young people that matters, and not necessarily a huge and vast audience. So we will give it the same kind of attention and the same kind of sincere sort of tasking before us that we would do for even a larger audience. And let me say that the panel discussion today is on the big picture and the Indo-Pacific, and you've already identified our very eminent speakers. There are 4 of them, and I will not introduce them since you've already done that a little while ago. Let me begin by simply introducing the topic so that I can frame this topic and provide a certain reference benchmarking for the other speakers to follow. The first is that the Indo-Pacific is today part of virtually every discourse that focuses on the change in the balance of power, the disruption in terms of the equilibrium in the geopolitical, geostrategic, and geoeconomic space. And it's not just to do with our region, but more broadly speaking, with the global situation at large. The fragile international situation today has been made even more vulnerable by the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been further weakened in many ways. And we have seen that multilateral structures have overall, by and large, failed to respond, though there has been an effort to take things forward, particularly in terms of the G20, where my Prime Minister has also provided that kind of impetus. A putative dyad comprising the United States and China and their rapidly deteriorating relations, the contestation that has emerged between the two of them is adding to this global discourse. It's dominating the discourse. In many ways, it is also herding the global community in one direction or the other. We have China's unilateralism, aggression, and revanchist policies that are to be seen all the way from the East China Sea to the South China Sea, and lately in Ladakh on India's continental boundaries as well. And so therefore, in this broad discourse, you have other elements of uncertainty. The global economy is in recession. You have a sort of ongoing trade contestation, a trade war, so to speak, that has resulted in greater trade protectionism and a focus on regional FTAs with select partners. You are also looking at technology being rapidly weaponized. And along the technology axis, there is much greater division of the global community into two distinct groups, for and against kind of discourse that we have seen. To add to this is China's growth, its economic rise, its efforts to redefine the geostrategic landscape in the broad expanse of the Indo-Pacific. As far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, natural spread of economic growth and prosperity since the end of the Second World War. In the initial decades after the Second World War, we were struck by the fact that it was the great market of the United States across the Pacific that enabled the rejuvenation of Japan, later spread economic growth and prosperity to South Korea, the Asian tigers, such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and eventually by the late 1970s, China was also benefiting from this very large market across the Pacific. But today you can say that especially in the first 2 decades of this century, that growth has been steadily spreading across the region. It is no longer the purview, an exclusive domain of East Asian countries or even Southeast Asian countries. We have seen that various parts of Asia have shown that ability to grow and to prosper. This includes South Asia and the dynamic eastern flank of Africa. And these oceanic spaces, the Pacific, the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean are increasingly conjoined in terms of both opportunities and challenges. In terms of economic growth, in terms of connectivity, in terms of infrastructure, these spaces are increasingly conjoined. In terms of traditional and non-traditional security threats also, these spaces are increasingly connected, including on issues such as trade, technology, terrorism, and territorial disputes. All the difficulties can be found dominating these oceanic spaces. This broad theater is now, as I said before, being sought to be redefined by China primarily. It is seeking to reconstruct and reorder an Asian hierarchy. While it speaks of Asia for Asians, it is veering away towards unipolarity as a principle of choice for itself. It wants the world, it wants the region, it wants neighbors to recognize that there is a new order and new hierarchy being shaped by various forces, and that China is going to dominate this hierarchy. It's also seeking a complete exclusion of the United States from its borders and the original Asia-Pacific region. In the South China Sea, the contestation has been worsened by its unilateral aggression and the taking over often through military means, various contested islands, building new ones where none existed, redefining the very notion of exclusive economic zone, redefining the very nature of the rules-based order that exists under UNCLOS. And all this after it has actually signed and ratified UNCLOS. So nothing can be more symbolic of this great indifference towards a rules-based order than the example of China in relation to UNCLOS. The US position, I think, is one of the most significant ones as to the future of the Indo-Pacific, for the simple reason that it is not an external player. For the last 70 years, not just the United States, but other big powers like the UK, France, have actually been part of this broad space, and they've contributed to economic growth, infrastructure, connectivity, and are likely to do so as factors that stabilize the geostrategic situation. So it's not that the whole region looks at them as an intruding presence or forces of disruption. That is primarily a Chinese viewpoint. ASEAN centrality, by the way, is key, as everybody says, including the Quad. At the end of any discussion, people speak of ASEAN centrality in their vision statements for the Indo-Pacific. But there is a certain complexity involved here, because firstly, the ASEAN has yet to finalize its own code of conduct with China. Secondly, apart from China, nobody else is directly involved with ASEAN countries in working towards a code of conduct which is hopeful that it will come through by 2021, but I personally doubt it very much, for it has been hanging fire for the last 18 odd years already. The draft code of conduct came about in 2002, and it is far from clear if you will make any further progress by 2021. But the complexity also lies in the fact that ASEAN is increasingly itself dependent on China, not just in terms of its economic well-being, but for many of them also for their security well-being. And this really, begs the question if the outcomes will really be truly objective. For China will have a chance to define certain outcomes in the code of conduct, which will affect beyond the ASEAN, the rest of us as well. The Quad, as you know, has picked up momentum since 2017, and nuanced differences have been reduced. All of them subscribe to freedom of navigation, overflight. They also subscribe to rules-based order, open, transparent system, and they have stopped using the word democracies or democratic, though the Quad is essentially a group of democracies who look at the challenges posed by ideologies that are opposite of democracies, but they are also increasingly aware that all the countries in the region are not necessarily democracies, that there exists in this broad theater a large spectrum of countries that have their own unique systems of governance, and that includes many who would like to be interlocutors but are not necessarily strictly democracies. So that's a wise thing for the Quad to have done. The strategic community in China regards the Quad as some kind of a nascent NATO, and that's for scholars to examine. Currently, of course, it's not a military bloc. It's not a naval, exercise. Though there is a possibility that Australia might be added on at the next Malabar. Japan came in on the Malabar in 2015 as a permanent participant, and let's see what happens with regard to Australia. As far as India is concerned, we believe in an inclusive security architecture for the region. And we also think that all the countries should have equal access to the natural resources of the oceans, that differences should be settled through dialogue, and many of these elements have been very clearly enunciated by the Prime Minister himself when he was at the Shangri-La dialogue 2 years ago. So this having been said, I will end by simply saying that as for India, it's very important to remember that we are the only among the Quad that have maritime interests as well as continental challenges to face. And India remains resolute in terms of its determination to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Some of that is quite explicitly evident in the kind of stand that we have taken against Chinese aggression in the high Himalayas. I also personally believe that India should be less reticent when it comes to beefing up its presence and cooperation with friendly countries in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The ANN command, we should do more with regard to that space, for the simple reason that that's also our immediate neighborhood, and the Indian Navy has its primary focus on the Indian Ocean, and the Western Indian Ocean is important, but the Eastern Indian Ocean is equally, if not more important. So therefore, I will end with these few words and to say that Asian prosperity really hinges on how well we can develop this security architecture, economic architecture for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region in years to come, one that recognizes the importance of multipolarity, of equality, and one that puts in place enduring structures where everyone can participate and benefit from the growth impulse that is bound to come back after the COVID pandemic ends. Today's discussions are expected to take a deeper dive into these issues, and I'm confident that new perspectives will emerge. So with these few words, I now request Vice-Admiral Anup Singh, the former CNC Eastern Naval Command, to kindly make his presentation. I would request him to use about 15 minutes to make his points, please. The floor is yours, Admiral Anup Singh.
Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy. As you rightly pointed out, it's a great pleasure to be interacting with the youth, particularly those who are in the universities, And this is really a very, very good initiative on the part of the organization called Diplomats Lab. I was very enthused by the fact, because I've always felt that the young do not really get informed about national and international security issues. And insofar as maritime security in the Indo-Pacific is concerned, it takes prime importance insofar as India is concerned. So looking at the audience, the youngsters, I have deliberately devised a PowerPoint presentation so that pictorially they'll be able to understand the maritime domain. You know, that man is primarily a continental creature, and that applies more to Indians than anybody else. And we, except for those who are really involved with the sea, people tend to set aside what happens in the seas around us, whereas they are most important insofar as economic transaction, global economic engagement, and India's engagement with the rest of the world is concerned. So before I start about the changing paradigm of India's maritime security, the topic that has been given to me, I thought, let me introduce to the audience, the participants, what really is involved insofar as India is concerned and the seas around, the ocean around it is concerned. So here we go. First of all, this is the Indian Peninsula, which is most important insofar as India's economy is concerned, insofar as geostrategic location of India is concerned. So we get a lot of vows from across the world to say, my God, this country has got a land border running into 15,000 kilometers. What an impressive figure.
Pardon me for interrupting, Admiral. Are you showing a PowerPoint presentation?
That's right. Are you able to see my slides?
No, not yet. I think you need to share it, and the
I had
webmaster needs to.
I'm so sorry. I had
permit you to share.
I pressed the share screen. I'll do it again.
Yes, please do that.
Are you able to see it now?
Yes, you just started your screen sharing, and I think it's popped up.
Okay.
Yes, that's right.
So I was saying that before I go on to the subject proper, let me show to the young participants pictorially what is really involved insofar as maritime security of India is concerned. So the world around us gives a vow whenever they hear the fact that there is a long subcontinental border that India shares with some countries, which is 15,000 kilometers long. Now, this impressive figure of 15,000 kilometers, no good to man or beast except for the 3 friendly countries marked by green. Even there, the total economic transaction insofar as trade is concerned is minuscule. Primarily because, and why is it no good to man or beast, is because, first of all, terrain does not permit across the northern borders any economic transaction. And secondly, contemporary history tells you that insofar as Pakistan and China are concerned, even if we had good roads and rail connectivity, nothing would have gone through, because such is the nature of these 2 neighbors. So for all practical purposes, we might as well, because of the peninsular nature, which is a God-given gift to us, call ourselves an island nation, because 97% by volume and 77% by weight of all trade takes place only through the sea. And therefore, you might also like to know an interesting fact that of the 6 largest peninsulas of the world, we happen to be the second at 2.07 million square kilometers insofar as the peninsular area is concerned. The largest one is 3.2 million square kilometers of the Arabian Peninsula, which is composed of 10 countries, including landlocked Jordan. And the smallest one is at 0.58 million square kilometers, the Iberian Peninsula. So you can see the strength of the maritime asset that India possesses. That gives you, that large peninsula gives you 200 plus ports with which to carry out global economic engagement, which constitutes between 37 and 43% of our current account. And that is because it varies depending on the cost of oil. Now, since we are talking about the Indo-Pacific and everything to do with today's theme is Indo-Pacific, I thought I will clarify that insofar as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, there are many definitions by people. Oh, it's an economic construct, it is a geostrategic construct, it is only a geographic construct. The Indo-Pacific, being absolutely practical, is geographic and therefore geostrategic. It runs from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the Americas. What are India's assets in this Indo-Pacific maritime domain? To start with, Indian investments in 46 hydrocarbon projects and across 24 countries, including 39 in coastal states, are spread, particularly hydrocarbon projects, are spread across the Indo-Pacific. India has the second largest diaspora, with which we are blessed, as you know. We superseded China a couple of years ago, and today, as per World Bank figures, received the largest repatriation. In 2019, it was $80 billion, and this year, already that figure seems to have succeeded, as seems to have been superseded, mainly because of layoffs, etc., in the Gulf. And we hope that COVID passes quickly and people will start getting their jobs back. Now, this ocean, despite being the smallest of the three, the Pacific, Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean, is unique in a bad way. It has a roof over its head, which is not a good thing for a water body. And that I say because the only access and entry points, exit points in this ocean are through 9 choke points. Choke points are navigational constrictions and are not really good insofar as geostrategy is concerned, because they give rise to easy transnational crime. Now, these are the choke points, starting from the Cape of Good Hope, which is a half choke point, Mozambique Channel, Bab el-Mandab, where all the piracy took place from 2006 to 12, Suez Canal, the Strait of Hormuz, from where 40% of global oil and gas come out, the Malacca, Sunda, and the Lombok Straits. So that is the environment in which India stands right in the center. Its peninsular pinnacle juts out 1,000 nautical miles into the Indian Ocean. Looking at this picture of the choke points, it is important to look at the lifeblood of the world, of the global economy, and that is oil and gas for the immediate future. Now, almost 40% of oil and gas on a daily basis passes through these choke points. 17.2 million barrels a day come out of the Suez Canal through the Strait of Hormuz, coming out of the Persian Gulf. 4 million barrels come out of the Suez Canal or go into the Suez Canal, 3.5 through the Strait of Bab el-Mandab or the Gulf of Aden, and 15.4 through the Malacca or the Lombok Straits. Now, if maths doesn't really add up, it is primarily because a large amount of oil comes from countries like Angola, from the west coast of Africa, from where we've also started buying, but China buys in large VLCCs. In this region, which has been the crux and the crucible of maritime terrorism, as you know, USS Cole was hit in the year 2000, 1 year before 9/11. A lot of people feel that all this started after 9/11. And this happened because Al-Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula, centered as it was in Pakistan, carried out this kind of an attack and became the norm thereafter. MV Limburg had a similar strike by AQAP in the year 2002, just off Aden Harbor. The first ship was inside Aden Harbor. This is our home, the business district of India, and you are all aware that the Taj Hotel and the Oberoi Hotel and the VT Terminus and one hospital was struck by terrorists who came from the sea. In 2013, a Chinese container vessel was struck by missiles coming out of the Sinai Peninsula, hit by terrorists who claimed thereafter that they tried to destroy the ship, not knowing that it was a Chinese ship. Very fortunately, the missile struck only the superstructure and nobody got injured. But you imagine in the Suez Canal, if a ship had got stranded or had sunk, for a year plus salvage wouldn't have been possible. And that would have meant everybody coming around the Cape of Good Hope. Now, these are our waters. Then the tanker attacks which took place in June 2019 in the Strait of Hormuz, you're all aware of the consequences and the aftermath of these incidents insofar as presence of major powers. Even Indian Navy started deploying itself in order to protect our oil-carrying vessels. Drone attacks in Saudi Arabia, even though they took place from the air, they affected very badly oil production from Saudi Arabia. But fortunately, within 2 weeks, because only one terminal was hit, it was restored. Drugs and the nexus between drug and gun running within the Indian Ocean is the largest insofar as transnational crime is concerned in our maritime domain as a transnational crime. Piracy in the Gulf of Aden, which I touched upon briefly, took place between 2006 and 2012 in the Strait of Bab el-Mandab, but expanded as close as 100 nautical miles from the Indian coast. And therefore, it was our responsibility to look after maritime security of international shipping. That's a picture which is a 24-hour grab in the year 2012 from what is now called IMAC. At that time, it was a prototype configuration. The Information Management Analysis Center based in Gurgaon, where we've called a lot of friendly countries to now position their liaison officers. You can see about 1,500 kilometer swath to the west and the east. And there are about 40,000 vessels, including fishing vessels from India, which have been grabbed in a 24-hour period along the west coast of India. And see, because of the threat of piracy in 2012, how close they came to the Indian peninsula. It never used to be the case. Then we must look at Chinese forays into the Indian Ocean, which actually started with this Yuan class, eavesdropping electronic intelligence gathering ships, which started coming in 2005. And when we asked the Chinese, even in our conferences, they said, oh, these are supposed to be actually tracking our satellites. But we knew what they were meant to be doing, and you would be able to assess what they're doing. One of the God-sent opportunities that China received was in 2008 when it got embarrassed because of piracy attacks on its merchant ships. One of those attacks was thwarted by an Indian warship and its helicopter, but the second one came as a great embarrassment to them. And ever since then, the Chinese have positioned 3 ships all the time. One of them is a tanker in the Gulf of Aden to protect its own shipping. We have positioned 1 ship. So have many other countries, major countries, including Japan. But the Chinese took that as an excuse and started creating a base in Djibouti, which you know now is a proper military maritime overseas base. That's a group of Chinese ships in the Gulf of Aden. Then they sent for the first time a nuclear-powered SSN, which is an attack submarine, on an Indian Ocean region trip, and they announced it, unlike anything that we ever saw in the history of nuclear-powered vessels, particularly submarines, since the Cold War. And they deliberately announced it, that it will be on a visit underwater in the Indian Ocean region in order to support and look at piracy incidents. They also have been sending, since 2014, their surface warships through the Sunda and back through the Lombok Strait in order to come close to Australian possessed islands like the Christmas Island. The Fedu Finolu Island was acquired by a Chinese tourism company from the Maldives for a cost of just $4.7 million on a lease of 50 years, which has been actually less than peanuts. And the purpose, as we knew, and we warned the Maldives at that time, is coming true now. They have already reclaimed a large part of land. They may not be able to build an airstrip because of the new political dispensation, which is very careful, but other things have already been built. Now, this is a picture that I wanted to show of Vietnam, where the Chinese, within the 9-dash line, came inside the EEZ of Vietnam. This is important because they have been trying to threaten our JV, the joint venture with the Vietnamese oil companies. And we have said, sorry, we are in the EEZ of Vietnam. So this is also part of maritime security and what has been happening over the last, I'll just finish in a minute. Now, I mentioned about Djibouti. They are also likely to position This is the base that they built between 2015 and 2017 in Djibouti. And the other base that is likely to come up is in Gwadar. There are already very clear indications that it is not part of CPEC alone. The PLA Navy is going to have a base either there or in Jiwani next door. OBOR, as you all know, is a web of maritime infrastructure, primarily based as a web as forecast by that think tank, by the consultant, defense consultant in America, that it is a string of pearls that they are wiving around. The whole game on the part of the Chinese is the acquisition of influence, which they were succeeding, but now there are indications that the east coast of Africa is not too happy. What is the remedy insofar as India is concerned? Geostrategy. Just as Ambassador Chinoy rightly said, we have been forgetting about the strength that we possess in the Andaman Nicobar Islands. All this while, we've been thinking of it as a strategic burden to look after islands which are 800 nautical miles away from mainland. But imagine, this provides us great strategic depth. 800 nautical miles, and if the compass is drawn by the same radius further away because of naval assets, it gives you 1,500 kilometers even with short-range maritime surveillance aircraft and ships, etc., into Southeast Asia. And that's what Southeast Asian countries have been looking forward to. It also provides us, the Andaman Nicobar Islands, strategic leverage because we are sitting 80 miles from the mouth of the Malacca Strait. And that, you would understand, is an obvious statement. So what do we need to do? Put ships, aircraft, and submarines in sufficient but not large numbers in the Andaman Nicobar Islands to show our presence and to keep check on anybody who casts an evil eye on India. And that will be a great amount of succor to the littorals fighting in the South China Sea. Another point is India's credo, Sagar, which was announced by Prime Minister Modi in March of 2015 from Mauritius. And we've been doing a lot of capacity building and capability enhancement amongst the lesser haves, particularly island developing states. The Prime Minister also at that time had announced that, look, we already have a trilateral security mechanism between Sri Lanka, Maldives, and us. Other island nations are welcome to join. And he hinted at Seychelles and Mauritius. Some things are moving. I would say that we should ask even Comoros, Madagascar, and many other littorals who are in mainland Africa, who are lesser haves, to join up in a league of maritime cooperation with India. We need maritime domain awareness for everybody. We are already doing EZ surveillance for Seychelles and Mauritius. For many years, we have white shipping agreements with many countries, including Australia, Singapore, and another 24 countries. And we have started setting up coastal surveillance radar systems, or CRSS, in Sri Lanka, in Maldives. They're already full. Now they are being established by Bharat Electronics Limited and Indian Navy's support in Mauritius and Seychelles. That will give us an eye for these countries to enable themselves to look at their own EZ and also share information with us. What is the way forward? No need to match China because we haven't got that depth of our economy, nor can we afford. But aggressive pursuit of Sagar and Quad, which will be discussed now by other speakers, cooperation through capacity building and capability enhancement, mentor IOR littorals against checkbook diplomacy by China, and build up defenses, allocate funding despite COVID. Thank you very much. I am so sorry I have taken 2 minutes extra.
Got it. Thank you very much, Admiral Anup Singh, for that very, very interesting presentation and for almost giving us a view as if from the bridge or from the naval ops room. Those slides were very beautifully made and only a thorough professional like you could have done that. I just have two brief comments on what you said. One is that people tend to forget that China's presence in the Indian Ocean, when it came about as you described it in 2008, essentially came after a gap of 600 years. And therefore, it is one of the biggest disruptors that you can think of in centuries. It is not as if the Chinese have been around in the Indian Ocean in centuries past. In fact, after Chang'e's voyages in the 15th century, they were nowhere to be seen. Of course, we need not swallow all that. Ex-British submariner Gavin Menzies says in his book, 1421, the year that China discovered the whole world. By that token, of course, the Chinese would have gladly colonized Australia also several centuries before Cook. But, that's the long and short of it. The other point is about the SSN Shang. I remember seeing a report subsequently which also wondered whether it was actually a conventional submarine and not a nuclear one. But that's for experts to see whether they actually recognized it for what it was. The short point that you made is the more relevant one, that nobody really comes into anti-piracy operations with submarines.
That's right.
To deal with little skiffs and a couple of ragtag pirates. You don't bring submarines, but that's an established presence now. It's a toehold, and it may only get stronger with Gwadar, Jiwani, and Djibouti and whatnot. As far as the trilateral is concerned, I'm so glad that you mentioned Dosti, as it's called, because I was instrumental in actually expanding the bilateral that we had with the Maldives to Sri Lanka as well, from the National Security Council end, and to take it up in the context of the dialogue between the three NSAs. This was about 9 years ago. Thereafter, there was a bit of disruption, as you know, in that trilateral.
Yes.
And once the government changed in the Maldives,
Yes.
it's again happy times for us. And Maldives has truly recognized the importance of an India first policy, as is being mentioned time and again by them. I now turn to our next speaker, that's Commodore Anil Jai Singh. The floor is yours. Say about 15 minutes, if you can stick to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for that. Thank you, Admiral Anup Singh, sir, for an excellent overview of the security dimension. I was wondering how in 15 minutes would you be able to give such a in-depth overview, but you have, as always, managed. I will cover in the next, I'll try and keep it short. The Indo-Pacific is a generic construct, which is what I'd request Gaurav. I asked him what exactly would he like me to speak on, and he said to speak on the Indo-Pacific in a generic context. So the idea of the Indo-Pacific, as we all know, came about in 2007 when Prime Minister Abe addressed the Indian Parliament and gave his Confluence of Two Seas address. And he spoke of the Indian and Pacific Oceans as a single body. And from there, I think this narrative started building up slowly. It continued to find expression. Hillary Clinton spoke about it, wrote about it. It became part of the strategic narrative in various defense white papers. The Australian 2013 defense white paper mentioned it. It found mention in Japan a couple of times. Analysts started writing about the Indo-Pacific. But I think the real wake-up call was the 2016 PCA ruling, when the Permanent Court of Arbitration gave a decision in favor of the Philippines, which the Chinese blatantly disregarded, despite themselves being signatories to the UNCLOS 1982. And this, I think, was really a wake-up call for the region, because they suddenly realized that China is very serious about its my way or the highway approach, and they're not going to brook any interference in what they think is their God-given right over the South China Sea. Of course, in 2017, Prime Minister Modi made a mention of the Indo-Pacific at the Raisina dialogue. And then again, the Indo-Pacific really picked up momentum when President Trump made his famous visit to East Asia and spoke of the Indo-Pacific, which led to the Pacific Command being renamed in 2018, the US Indo-Pacific Command. Though, of course, its geographic coordinates and its area of responsibility did not change. But nevertheless, it was an acknowledgement that there's a larger strategic entity now that we all have to look at. And I think for India, the defining moment of the Indo-Pacific was, of course, Prime Minister Modi's keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue, where he clearly defined the parameters of engagement, of India's engagement with the Indo-Pacific, with the concept of the Indo-Pacific, and he clearly articulated India's understanding of its geographic extent and underlined India's commitment to an inclusive engagement with the region. In fact, to quote, he said, "Respecting freedom of navigation and adhering to international norms is essential for peace and economic growth in the larger and interlinked marine geography of the Indo-Pacific," which sort of said it all about the Indo-Pacific. The crystallization of this idea of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic construct has been driven, of course, primarily by the rise of China. and seems to be getting increasingly polarized by the present Sino-US tension and the US tone of its response to China's aggressive intent in the region, particularly so during President Trump's presidency. Of course, Chinese intent was the reason for the US rebalance to the region in President Obama's this thing, and led to the US declaring at that time the 21st century as the US's Pacific century. But his statesman-like approach to the region did not, of course, yield the desired results. And China continued its strident behavior aimed at taking ownership of the South China Sea with scant regard to the regional sentiment. And in fact, in hindsight, many regard this as President Obama's major foreign policy failure. President Trump, on the other hand, in his very characteristic direct manner, and after some initial hesitancy, sort of took the Chinese bull by its horns and has articulated a far more aggressive policy to contain China economically and militarily. In his national security strategy, he has clearly identified both China and Russia as revisionist powers and is now crossing a very dangerous red line by directly needling China with his open support to Taiwan, which is absolutely non-negotiable as far as China is concerned. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's statement in July, which rejected all Chinese claims in the South China Sea as unlawful and criticized Beijing's bullying tactics, could not have been more direct in his criticism of China. The bipartisan support of the US legislature to that statement indicates that even if there is a change in the US presidency, the US approach to China may become more nuanced, but any fundamental shift is unlikely. The US-China standoff has reached alarming proportions with the overt US support to Taiwan, and I think China is looking at it very seriously. I hope the US knows exactly what it's getting into, as sometimes one wonders. But the concern over maintaining a rules-based international order and a free and open Indo-Pacific is not only critical for this region, but in this era of globalization and trade interdependencies, threatens the global movement of commerce. This concern has led even Germany, normally very reticent about involving itself outside Europe and often perceived to be tolerant of China, to announce its Indo-Pacific strategy, with veiled references to not favoring the rule of the strong. This is significant for two reasons. Firstly, Germany has considerable trade and manufacturing interests in China. It is one of the largest markets for its three auto manufacturers, which could get jeopardized. And secondly, with France and the UK also having declared their intention to support the existing order with a naval presence, the German shift is part of a larger effort to integrate Europe, the rest of Europe, into this strategy. China, of course, has deployed a counter strategy to expose fault lines in the EU by wooing some of the less politically integrated members of that group, and is also trying to drive a wedge in the US-Europe relationship. I'll now talk about India for a few minutes. One of the most successful outcomes, I think, of India's diplomatic outreach in the last 6 years has been its Act East policy. It has not only consolidated the initiatives taken by the Look East policy, but has broken a lot of new ground. India now has comprehensive strategic partnerships with most of the countries that matter east of Malacca. The Prime Minister has visited the islands of the South Pacific and assured them of India's support to assuage their concerns. India recognizes the centrality of ASEAN in the Asia Pacific, and in an unprecedented departure from convention, invited the heads of government of all the 10 ASEAN nations as chief guests for the Indian Republic Day celebrations to commemorate 25 years of India's engagement with ASEAN. This engagement is being taken further with various connectivity projects over land and sea, which will prove economically beneficial not only to India's eastern and northeastern regions, but also to our neighbors in the Bay of Bengal. BIMSTEC is being given a boost and will become an area of connectivity and engagement in the Bay of Bengal. There is a perception that the Indo-Pacific is Pacific-centric and the Indo ends at India. This may not be entirely untrue because most of the narrative is centered east of Malacca. In fact, as I mentioned, the US Pacific Command has also, despite being renamed the US Indo-Pacific Command, not found any change in its geographic coordinates, which end at the west coast of India. West of that, of course, for the rest of the Indian Ocean is the US Central Command and parts of it under the US Africa Command. In fact, despite this strategic map being a Western creation, it is China who it seems to have embraced the concept of the Indo-Pacific. It is claiming ownership of the South China Sea. It is seeking to dominate the East China Sea. Its footprint in the Indian Ocean is expanding rapidly, and it has, through its ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, established a physical presence across the length and breadth of the Indian Ocean. There is a presence, military or otherwise, in Thailand, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Maldives, Iran, Seychelles, Madagascar, Kenya, and so on. It is strengthening relations with the Gulf countries, and its recent overtures to Iran, which is smarting from US-imposed sanctions, does not augur well for India. It has established an overseas base in Djibouti, which Admiral Anup Singh mentioned, and will soon be in full control of Gwadar. India too has taken various initiatives at increasing its presence in the region, but will require to focus its somewhat more limited capacity vis-a-vis China towards strengthening its strategic neighborhood through building capacity in the region. India's focus, given its current capacity, should be on the Indo-Pacific. We have extensive interests in the Western Indian Ocean, including the security of our energy and the security of our diaspora, which is a major source of our foreign exchange reserves. In 2015, as was mentioned during his visit to Mauritius, the Prime Minister highlighted the concept of SAGAR, an acronym for Security and Growth for All in the region. In the last few years, India has made considerable efforts towards capacity building with our maritime neighbors, including the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, Bangladesh, etc. These initiatives are aimed at securing the region and enhancing India's maritime domain awareness, which is a critical capability to preempt the multitude of traditional, non-traditional, and transnational threats bedeviling this region. India's initiatives as the first responder in natural and man-made crises in the Indian Ocean further reinforces its standing as a net security provider in the region. Any discussion of the Indo-Pacific would be incomplete without mention of the Quad. This informal four-nation group, comprising the US, Japan, India, and Australia, has yet not achieved its potential due to differing perceptions amongst the members. The adherence to a rules-based order and a free and open Indo-Pacific is crystal clear. China openly resents it, and ASEAN till recently was suspicious of it because it did not take into account ASEAN centrality and presence at the very core of this region. There are differences amongst its four partners, which was apparent after the meeting in 2017, which led to divergent statements emanating from each. While for the US, containment of China is the main aim, or appears to be the main aim, India and Japan, for good reason, had desisted from any such direct reference to China, though that now seems to be changing. And Australia was a hesitant power with considerable trade ties with China. So low-hanging fruit like HADR and etc. were identified as areas of convergence to build interoperability and understand each other better. Till a few months ago, I personally believe that the COVID pandemic was an opportunity which the Quad failed to capitalize on. I think the recent pushback against China, for which it has only itself to blame, has provided an opportunity for these nations to identify its future strategy and create a more inclusive architecture with other countries in the region. The centrality of ASEAN has finally been recognized, which is integral to any interaction in the region. The interaction has also now been elevated to the levels of foreign ministers, which is a very positive development. However, whether this remains an informal dialogue or will it ultimately result in an alignment or a partnership, or very unlikely but an alliance, remains to be seen. The External Affairs Minister not so long ago, about a fortnight ago, very clearly reiterated India's foreign policy cornerstone of strategic autonomy. So it is unlikely that this will become an alignment, but like somebody mentioned, partnerships will definitely happen. One interesting aside in the Quad is that even though it may have disappointed to some extent as a four-nation grouping, there has been a lot of engagement amongst partners in a trilateral or bilateral context, and they have been far more successful in identifying both convergences and addressing their divergences. Finally, a word about multilateralism and partnerships. For the next 2 years, India will be a member of the UN Security Council, and during this period will also take over the presidency of the G20. This will present India an opportunity to leverage its principled and inclusive approach towards driving change in recognizing the contemporary realities of the emerging global order and the challenges of climate change, etc., that threaten global as well as regional security. Since time is now running out, I will not draw a comparison on the military capability in the Indo-Pacific region, except to say that despite the PLA Navy now being the largest Navy in the world by numbers, the US Navy remains the world's most powerful Navy, and in the Indian Ocean, the Indian Navy has a very distinct edge. However, China's pace of warship building, with 20 to 25 ships and submarines being commissioned every year, this edge will definitely narrow. We have to therefore ensure that we are not found wanting in our ability to defend our strategic and maritime interests in the region and beyond. Well, I've finished, sir. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't exceeded my time by too much.
No,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commodore Anil Jai Singh, for again giving us a very fine presentation and adding to the perspectives and remarks that have already been made by previous speakers. I just want to highlight a couple of points and then move on to the next speaker. One is that the PCA ruling of 2016. Of course, it's more like a PLA ruling as far as the islands are concerned, but certainly the PCA ruling was ignored by China. But the interesting part is that the US, as you know, in 2016 did not take sides. It simply called upon the two parties as signatories to UNCLOS to abide by that ruling. And on the substance of the argument itself, it had said that it's a technical matter and that the US would need time to study it. So that's on record. But when you fast forward to 2020, the world has obviously changed in 4 years, primarily as a result of President Trump's policies, which are a far cry from what President Obama was doing. And so if you say that President Obama made utterances and pronouncements about a pivot to Asia, you might say that it was President Xi Jinping who actually did the real pivot to the South China Sea and the East China Sea. But you still have to give President Trump and the United States some credit now for actually having put in place some pivot to that region, and I think you brought it out in your remarks. But the interesting thing is that as of August, the United States of America has publicly pronounced its own position now being in sync with the substantive point of the PCA ruling. In other words, the US position now is identical to the PCA ruling. That's a big change. The second point is about Australia and Japan, and I'm sorry because the next two speakers are from Japan/Hudson and Australia. I want to make a small point, and this is something that I'm saying in very good spirit and good spirits, and to be taken as a very frank remark coming from a friend of both Australia and Japan. Mind you, panelists and attendees, I'm probably, if I were a bodybuilder, I should be called Mr. Indo-Pacific, because I'm the only one who has served in all the Quad countries, so to speak. So I've spent 20 years of my life, by the way, dealing with the other side also, the Chinese. But I've served in Japan, Australia, obviously in India and in the United States, quite apart from my long years in China. But that apart, the short point I want to make is that relations with Japan and with Australia have come a long way since the hiccup of 1998 and the immediate aftermath of our nuclear tests, when we had some difficulties and a short-lived downturn in our relations. With Japan, we have splendid ties today, as you know, through the hard work of both sides. It's a special strategic and global partnership like none other, with the potential to be the most important relationship in the 21st century. With Australia too, we've come such a long way. I remember when I was the Indian delegate to the first committee at the United Nations 28 years ago in 1992. My friend, he was a friend of mine actually from Australia, and he used to say that the Indian Ocean is not an Indian lake, But those were the days of the Indian Ocean, a zone of peace, and the politics of the Cold War, and I mean, had just ended. So it was a very different situation. And today, Australia is one of our closest partners. And we have, again, a very close strategic partnership, both with Japan and with Australia. We have signed the cross-servicing logistics sharing agreement. But there's one point I want to make here, that look, unlike the United States, which has been quite vocally supportive of India's position in the ongoing border tensions with China in Ladakh, Japan and Australia have been a little reticent, in coming out and speaking openly. They may have their own reasons because of a certain amount of interdependence with China. Both are conscious of their very close economic ties, and both recognize that also. And more importantly, Japan and Australia, speaking among friends, do show Aksai Chin as an integral part of China, Japan and Australia. The United States shows Aksai Chin as disputed territory, but Australia and Japan continue to show Aksai Chin as a part of China. This is unlike the US position. My point as a friend of both Japan and Australia, and believe me, I love both of you guys. These are my two favorite countries. But projections by strategic partners of India's boundaries and territorial claims, they assume a deeper salience, especially in light of the convergence of interests that we have in the Indo-Pacific. And I would urge you as scholars and as diplomats to kindly take a fresh look at this. I call it like, you work your way through, the stomach to a man's heart, as they say, But strategic partners should work their way into each other's hearts through the cartographic menu. And so cartographic depiction of each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, in my view, is something we should give some importance to. That having been said, I've got it off my chest. But then, we are friends and I can speak freely to my friends. By the way, I've written about it, so there's nothing, sort of reticent on my part about it. I now turn to Dr. Satoru Nagao to make his presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, sir. Before I start the presentation, I need to inform you one thing. Maybe there is a high possibility you are right, but at the same time, Japan's stance toward the Aksai Chin is maybe a little ambiguity, I believe, because when I bought a map, which made based on governmental policy, which gets the permission from the government, the Aksai Chin is not clear written for the China side, just ambiguity, unclear region in the map. So this means that Japan's stance toward Aksai Chin, there is a possibility it is still disputed or the unclear sovereignty in the Japan.
I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but I must as a friend.
Yeah, because you ambassador, maybe you have already checked many things, I think.
I need to actually make a clear point here that I base my remarks and assessment on the basis of the official website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in both these countries, DFAT and the Foreign Ministry in Japan, DFAT in Canberra, and they carry maps that highlight the position that I've stated. So I'm not talking about any map published and available in a bookstore with the official support of either foreign ministry, but I'll be happy to share these maps with you. Very gladly, I will do that with the source indicated as well. Thank you very much.
In this case,
please
I should learn from you.
Please continue. No, please. Mutually, we learn from each other. Carry on, please.
And about the presentation, I will use PowerPoint, so I will share the data. Wow. Can you see my PowerPoint data, the blue colored? Thank you very much. So I will start the presentation. So thank you very much for giving me a chance to make presentation. It is an honor for me. This presentation is the US-China competition in the Indo-Pacific. How should India and Japan respond? Of course, India, Japan, Australia, but Australia, maybe next presenter will explain more clearly, I think. So I belong to the US think tank now, Hudson Institute. but analyze the US strategy. But this is a perspective from Japan. I need to explain why I choose this title. The US-China competition has been escalating. This is my picture. Vice President Mike Pence of the United States remarked to the Hudson Institute in October 2018. As a good businessman, I advertise my working place, maybe. But this is one of the examples to indicate that even before the COVID-19 crisis, the United States has already been stepping up the pressure on China. But the COVID-19 crisis accelerates the situation. Firstly, because the novel COVID-19 virus oriented in China and Beijing conceals the information that ultimately lead its rapid global spread. And while the world faced the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, China has undertaken a large number of aggressive military operations throughout the Indo-Pacific region. In the East China Sea, Beijing has increased military and paramilitary activities around the Senkaku Island of Japan and passed the Japanese fishing boat inside of the Japan's territorial sea. In Taiwan, the Chinese Coast Guard ship shot in the air and rammed Taiwan Coast Guard ship from the rear. And moreover, Chinese fighter jets have repeatedly entered Taiwan's airspace. At Hong Kong, China passed a national security law to crack down on the democratic movement supported by most of residents. In the South China Sea, they are very busy. In April 2020, it sank a Vietnamese fishing boat. On the disputed island that it built, it has recently established new districts and two new research facilities in an attempt to legitimize its claim. And it has fortified them by deploying new military aircraft. And Chinese survey ship, escorted by Coast Guard ship, also entered the Vietnam's and Malaysia's exclusive economic zone to further military research. Moreover, China dispatched aircraft carrier battle group around Japan, Taiwan, and South China Sea to hold exercises and intimidate these countries. In yet another incident, the Chinese fleet dispatched to the near Hawaii targeted the US military plane with a laser in international airspace. In the Indian Ocean, China sent 12 drones to collect information that can be used for Beijing's submarine activities. And in the India-China border area, 5,000 Chinese troops entered the Indian side and clashed with Indian forces. The 20 brave Indian soldiers were sacrificed their lives. All of this has happened during the COVID-19 crisis. So furthermore, since the pandemic will undoubtedly affect the outcome of the US presidential election in November, so United States is very frustrated with China. Therefore, the US-China relations are becoming increasingly tense. Other countries must adapt the new circumstances. For India and Japan, this situation raises three questions. What change should we expect from an escalation of the US-China tension? What problems will we face? And how should we respond? So what change should India and Japan expect from the escalation? For India and Japan, most important question influencing long-term planning is, which side is likely to win, China or the United States? The United States is now world's only superpower, a status it acquired by defeating Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union. Can we learn the lesson from the history? Japan has an unfortunate and tragic history of war with the United States. Yet precisely for that reason, it can confidently tell the world not to underestimate the US policy toward China. During the 1920s, US developed a set of hypothetical war scenarios for engaging other countries. a common practice in the scenario planning. Before World War II, the US plan for the confrontation with Japan was known as Orange Plan. So it was not precisely executed, but it did indicate a general strategic direction. Similarly, US has a war plan prior to its confrontation with Germany in World War II as a Black Plan. But when this plan was declassified in 1974, people were surprised. Before World War II, the US also had a war plan to confront the British and Canada as a Red Plan. This fact indicating that US prepare for all scenarios, even unlikely ones. Therefore, the Japanese take seriously the US frustration with China and believe that Washington has a plan for confronting Beijing. Additional evidence suggests that recent US actions are part of long-term strategy. An example is the US-China high-tech war, technological war, and Washington's ban on products made by Huawei and ZTE. This process has started during the Obama administration, which is 2012. The published the investigating report on the US national security issue posed by the Chinese telecommunication companies Huawei and ZTE. After its publication, the US government began to ban the federal agency from purchasing from the two Chinese telecom companies. So Washington has merely begun to implement this long-term strategy more aggressively. If the US has a plan, why has it recently stepped up its effort against China? First reason is Beijing's activities are very challenging. But secondly, now is the best chance the US will get, because the country might only be able to win if it steps up now. Some simple facts confirm that now is the best time for the US to pressure China. So next slide is here. This is a US spend more on defense. If US is 100, China is 25. This was 2018 when the US started to say China is strategic competitor. Next slide is GDP. US is still leading GDP, but in this case, if US is 100, China is 60. Next one is investment for the research and development. You spend more, but if US is 100, China spend 80. So if the US acts now, it will have the advantage over China. But without such effort, there is a possibility that US advantages will decline one by one. So if so, what kind of strategy will the Washington choose? Simply said, militarily, the US had tried to maintain balance, but economically, the US had tried to decouple from China and make it poorer. Simply said, make China poor again. The US decided on balancing strategy militarily because on China's pattern of expansion in the South China Sea this decade. We should consider the recent history of the South China Sea. Japan's Ministry of Defense published a slide that shows why balancing strategy is best option. This slide shows that China's maritime expansion has been based on military balance. When France, United States, Soviet Union withdrew from the South China Sea, it emboldened China. Following each country withdraw from the region, China expanded its presence and occupied islands and reefs, which the Philippines and Vietnam claims. Therefore, we must prioritize maintaining a military balance and to avoid to create power vacuum China can exploit. Economically, the US will make China poor again. Because China's problem is problem of money. When China has enough money, it can rapidly modernize its military China's wealth also allows it to invest great deal of money in small countries. The small countries' indebtedness allow China to expand its influence there. Countries with significant Chinese investment and debt hesitate to criticize China even if it does not follow the international rule. For this reason, the United States will use trade war, economic sanctions, or other means in attempt to weaken China economically. So what problems will India and Japan face as a result of new policy? Militarily, Washington has asked its allies to increase their defense spending and shoulder more of security burden. Economically, it will also impose sanctions against government officials and companies that trade with China. So how should India and Japan respond to this situation? In the long run, India and Japan will need to cooperate with the United States. Why? Because the US will win its competition with China. In the short term, however, India and Japan must adapt a new emerging reality. There are two things we should do. First, we should improve our own defense capabilities. What is Japan doing? Japan is acquiring limited offensive capabilities and will import more than 100 F-35 stealth fighter jets from the United States. India can also increase its defense capabilities in the India-China border area by using American-made equipment, such as attack helicopter, heavy lift helicopter, ultralight howitzers, with the precision-guided ammunitions, patrol airplanes, heavy and middle-class transport planes that employed by the Indian Army's 70 Corps and its air mobile capability of the Indian Air Force. And it is not only the US interest, but also the India's interest for India to provide security in the Indian Ocean region. Second, we should not depend on China economically. India and Japan must reduce our economic dependence on Beijing if we wish to avoid becoming passenger on the sinking ship. Both India and Japan have already started to reduce its dependence on China. In the case of Japan, for example, in April 2020, Japan earmarked 2.2 billion of its record economic stimulus package to help local manufacturers shift production out of China. Until September 2020, more than 1,700 Japanese companies are waiting in line to withdraw from China. Applications swell to 11 times the budget. And indeed, many Japanese companies have already relocated their factories in China to Southeast Asia or South Asia. As a result, the number of Japanese citizens living in China is decreasing. This figure indicates this number. Decreasing has gone from 150,000 Japanese living in China in 2012 to the 120,000 in 2018. During the same period, number of the Japanese living in the United States has increased from 410,000 in 2012 to the 447,000 in 2018. So therefore, India and Japan should cooperate with the US militarily and economically to help them to come out ahead in these difficult times. This is what I want to say, and this policy will make us to be the winner of this competition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Satoru Nagao. One quick comment on what you said, about the US advantages, which are likely to decline one by one if not enough effort is made by the US now. I think many observers also believe, and you might have come across them as well, who feel that notwithstanding China's progress, the US is likely to remain by far the more preeminent power as far as economic and particularly scientific and technological capabilities are concerned well into the 21st century. There is a good reason why people believe that the US also has a tremendous capacity to reinvent itself, especially in terms of research and development and technological advantages. And I think broadly speaking, the US may not have a policy of making China poor again, but the way I see it is that the US does have a policy now, it seems, of preventing the Chinese from taking undue advantage in terms of their absolutely skewed trade relations, where there's such a huge imbalance that it's almost like siphoning off wealth from one economy to the other. I think the Americans are waking up finally to that danger. They have to weigh that against the advantages of having cheap products all over, affordable in the US economy coming out of China. But that's for them to see how much of that manufacturing they can actually bring back to the United States as well. Not easy when costs of manufacturing are high, but that applies equally to Japan and Australia because you simply don't have that advantage of a cost arbitrage, labor arbitrage. And you're right about China occupying a vacuum because nature abhors a vacuum. And once the US reoriented its own focus in the aftermath of 9/11 towards international terrorism, the war against international terrorism, the South China Sea was kind of abandoned along with large parts of the Asia Pacific, so to speak, and the Chinese naturally stepped in. There is pressure by the US on countries to, follow a certain line, but I think that is harder in the case of Japan than it is in the case of India to some extent, because I say this merely because we don't have that level of interdependence with China in terms of our own supply chains, or the prosperity or economic well-being of our own companies does not depend on what they do in China. Whereas for Japan, that might be a kind of limiting factor, just as the vastness of the Chinese market is for Australia's natural resources. So that's a very good point. But I do feel that there is merit in Japan coming in more, not just in terms of India-Japan cooperating in the defense space, but also particularly Japan coming in and investing in the Indian defense manufacturing sector. Now that we have a list of items that have been publicly identified for limiting imports, those are the items that will be sourced locally, and billions of dollars worth of items are now going to be sourced locally. So this is a great chance for Japan and its extraordinary technologies to come into India in electronics, semiconductors, carbon fiber, lots of things, certain other, engine technologies. So more power to your pen when you write about such things. I now turn to Mr. Patrick Mullins of the Australian High Commission. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's a real honour to join the Diplomats Lab and our very experienced and esteemed panel for our important discussions on the Indo-Pacific this evening. I share Ambassador Chinoy's comments earlier, applauding the Diplomats Lab for this type of initiative. It's really important to engage young people on the most important issues that are going to be at the centre of the future of our respective countries. I've been asked to speak on the enduring interests of Australia and India in an inclusive and rules-based Indo-Pacific. And what I propose to do is to give you a sense of Australia and India's respective approaches, the impact of COVID-19, and how we are moving forward working together and with others. For Australia, the Indo-Pacific is our region. It is where we live. It comprises the Indian Ocean, for which is vital, like many countries, for our trade and energy security, and where we have an important role as a security provider given our large exclusive economic zone and maritime search and rescue area. The region has ASEAN at its core, and it embraces our South Pacific family. It includes our strategic partners, such as the United States, India, Japan, Indonesia, the Republic of Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand. And we think India's contribution to the region is essential. Many of our speakers have highlighted the Prime Minister Modi's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which outlined India's vision for the Indo-Pacific, which included open trade, transparency, a rules-based order where the rights of all states are respected, and a central role for ASEAN. And Australia couldn't agree more. In many ways, the Indo-Pacific is a natural bridge between Australia and India. Australia and India are quintessential Indo-Pacific countries. Australia plays a strong role in the South Pacific, as India does in South Asia, and we converge in Southeast Asia, where we both are important players and partners for ASEAN. The Indo-Pacific, as our speakers have outlined to you this evening, is significant for our future. The migration of power and influence from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific is absolutely with us now. It is a region predicted to deliver 2/3 of the world's growth, and it is home to 6 of the 10 biggest military spenders. But COVID-19 has accelerated many of the worrying trends we've been facing in the Indo-Pacific for some time. The pressures on rules, norms, and institutions is becoming more acute. Tensions over territorial claims across the region are rising, whether that be on the line of actual control between India and China, the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And responding, Ambassador Chinoy, to your comments before, I just thought I'd note the comments which have been made by our High Commissioner on the developments in the Himalayas. Australia believes that territorial disputes and competing claims should be resolved peacefully by claimant countries and in ways consistent with international law. Australia urges restraint along the line of actual control and supports moves towards de-escalation. And as the High Commissioner has told the External Affairs Minister of India, Australia opposes any attempts to unilaterally alter the status quo, which only serve to increase tension and the risk of instability. And we think that it's important that the bilaterally agreed principles and norms that have helped prevent escalation or miscalculation in the border areas for many decades continue to be observed. So through COVID-19, we've seen an increase in the use of grey zones and coercive tactics. The US-China relationship, as previous speakers have noted, is perhaps the region's most important, is under further strain. And the region is increasingly the focus of the dominant global contest of our age. The pandemic is causing loss of life and threatens to undermine the hard-won gains on development and economic growth that we've seen in the region in the past decades. And as the Prime Minister of Australia said recently, even as we grapple with the pandemic in each of our own countries, we must prepare for a post-COVID region that is poorer, more dangerous, and more disorderly. And here at the Australian High Commission, we've recognised, and as indeed the broader Australian government has too, that India is playing a proactive, principled and constructive leadership role in the Indo-Pacific during COVID-19. Indian leaders and ministers have been impressive in their outreach during the crisis, coordinating with key countries across capitals in South Asia, ASEAN, East Africa and East Asia. And we have welcomed India's regional leadership convening a SAARC virtual summit, establishing a SAARC emergency COVID fund. India has shown its contribution to the public good by quickly deploying medical teams and sending equipment and medicines across the region. We've recently seen Indian teams responding to oil spills in Mauritius and Sri Lanka, and New Delhi has kept up its pace of engagement with its ASEAN partners. For Australia, we see it's vital that countries like India, Japan, Australia are not bystanders. Not only the US and China, but all of us have agency to shape the developments in the Indo-Pacific. Indeed, as India has shown, we think it is important to step up and advocate for the type of region we seek. And for Australia, that's one where rules and norms provide for peace and the ability for us to all prosper. There are open markets, rules and cooperation to lead to greater economic integration and growth, and that we are all more resilient to the economic and security challenges we face by working together, whether that's on resilient supply chains, critical minerals, cybersecurity, health security, maritime security. And we're going about this as Australia in a number of ways. We're making sure our own economy is strong, because at the end of the day, our ability to keep our citizens safe and contribute to the Indo-Pacific is underpinned by a strong economy. To buttress this, we are working towards greater economic openness and to adherence to rules and norms. These are the values that have underpinned the economic growth, indeed, and the human development outcomes we've seen in the previous decades. When it comes to India, we welcome the opportunity to re-engage on a bilateral comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, which was an outcome of the virtual summit between our prime ministers on the 4th of June. We're also working closely with Japan and India on a trilateral supply chain resilience initiative. And elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific, we've recently seen our comprehensive economic partnership with Indonesia enter into force. And that's going to help both countries grow back stronger from COVID-19. We've reprioritized our aid budget, our $4 billion annual budget in the Indo-Pacific, helping countries to recover. And we're stepping up on what we're doing to build a free and open inclusive order in the region. I want to point out, for those who missed it, the 2020 Australian Defence Strategic Update and Force Structure Plan, which boosted investment in our defence force capabilities by 40% from our previous review in 2016. This is during COVID-19. And we will make new investments in land, sea and air-based long-range and hypersonic strike missiles. And this comes on top of what is already the biggest regeneration of our Navy since the Second World War and the transition to a 5th generation Air Force. We have recently made the largest investments in our cybersecurity capabilities in the history. These investments are guided by the assessment that we need to be able to more effectively shape, deter and respond to the increased challenges we are facing, most particularly in the Northeast Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia and South Pacific. And we're busy working through ASEAN-led institutions, the Indian Ocean Rim Association and the Pacific Islands Forum and related bodies to develop a common understanding and shared regional approaches to maritime safety and security, health and technology. And in these lines of effort, we are working more closely than ever before with our partners. And one of those, the key one perhaps, is India. This was evident during the virtual summit between our prime ministers on the 4th of June. Prime Minister Modi said during the media remarks during the virtual summit that it was Australia and India's sacred duty to be a factor for stability for the region and the world. And this is what drove our historic elevation of our relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. We concluded 8 high-impact agreements covering issues of massive importance to the Indo-Pacific, including defence and maritime security, cyber and critical technology, critical minerals, education, water and public administration and governance. And if I take just 2 of these areas, I can demonstrate how Australia and India cooperation can help secure a more safe and prosperous rules-based Indo-Pacific. First, the 2 leaders signed a joint maritime declaration and a detailed action plan where both countries have agreed to work together under India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative to influence the direction of rules, norms and behaviour in the maritime sphere. We will work hand in hand with our partners in ASEAN and the Indian Ocean region to strengthen regional approaches to open sea lanes, the rule of law, responsible use of maritime resources supporting economic development. And both Australia and India seek an inclusive region underpinned by rules and the rights of all states. This will be further buttressed by a mutual logistics support arrangement, similar to the one recently concluded between Japan and India, which Ambassador Chinoy mentioned. And second, it also paves the way for more complex joint defence activities between our countries. In another field, secondly, our leaders committed to a framework arrangement on cyber and cyber-enabled critical technologies. With cyber intrusions and attacks an increasing threat in both of our countries and a vector of strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific, we recognise that it is vital for democracies like Australia and India to guide the rules and standards in emerging fields like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. These will profoundly shape the future security and prosperity of our citizens. Our officials and researchers will work even more closely than before in this area, and we will shortly announce a grants program to provide opportunities for Australian and Indian researchers and their counterparts across the Indo-Pacific to work together on these key challenges and opportunities. And so by taking forward the agenda set by Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison, Australia and India have a greater ability to respond to the challenges we both face in the Indo-Pacific, which have been exacerbated by COVID-19. And to do this, we are working increasingly in tandem with others. The Quad is becoming an increasingly useful mechanism for strengthening shared interests in maritime security, counter-terrorism, and cybersecurity. We are working closely in trilateral settings with India and Japan, and India and Indonesia, to promote economic growth and inclusive regional approaches to shared challenges. And indeed, Japan and Indonesia are linchpins. They are vibrant Asian democracies and vital partners for Delhi and Canberra to shape a more open, secure and prosperous region. France is another important partner, and on the 9th of September, the Foreign Secretaries of India, Australia and France met and discussed opportunities and practical cooperation, particularly in the maritime field in the Indian Ocean. So to conclude, we should be under no illusion that we face a contested, poorer and more challenging Indo-Pacific as a result of COVID-19. And Australia and India can best respond if we work collaboratively, combining our capabilities and strengths along those with other partners like Japan, the US, Indonesia, France, Vietnam, the Republic of Korea and New Zealand. We must be agile, strategic and work well in coalitions flexibly, and we must strengthen and reform regional institutions so they deliver for all our citizens. We have seen India step up during the pandemic, something which Australia welcomes, and Australia too is not going to be a bystander, and we will work hand in hand with others. It is incumbent on governments, businesses and researchers, and indeed young students here in the audience, to work together so we can arrest the worrying trends we are facing and shape a more prosperous and safe Indo-Pacific for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Patrick Mullins, for your very perceptive remarks. And I couldn't agree with you more when you say that India and Australia must work even closer together. We already have now a comprehensive strategic partnership in place. Both sides have worked hard to achieve this high level of cooperation, coordination and convergence of interests as we have with Japan. And we have seen how over the years we have worked hard to create the 2+2 structures, the trilateral dialogue involving Japan as well. I have myself participated in some of these and have seen the mutual benefits to be had from such integration. You did not mention it, but I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Australia itself plays a very important role in the evolving geostrategic contours of the Indo-Pacific, because it's such a big and vital player, particularly in the South Pacific. In the South Pacific, it's countries like Australia and New Zealand that really are the big boys there, and more power to your elbow as you try to create an enduring economic and security architecture in that part of the world as well. I do believe that our defense partnership has come a long way, and that India and Australia are inching ever closer together. India now participates in the Kakadu exercise, in the pitch black Air Force exercise, and we really must build on this again for mutual benefit. And you really come a long way too with your newly created structures for foreign investment scrutiny into the Australian economy. Like the American CFIUS, you have your own structures now in place, which are working very well. And the kind of money that you'll spend over the next 10 years as a result of your defense force restructuring and additional budgetary allocations is about 575 billion Australian dollars over the next 10 years, I believe. So that's a huge sum of money. And it's going to really pitchfork Australia into the very center of the unfolding saga of the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much for those very perceptive remarks. Now I can see that we have a short Q&A session, and we must close quickly because we have overshot our time. And I'm sure the students probably have to go home or to do their homework as well. There are a couple of questions. The first is by Anshu Kumar. And Anshu asks, do you think that the consideration to rejuvenate the Quad is antagonistic to the non-alignment policy of India? Or is it a new transition towards alliance or a kind of realist policy? The second question is from Abdul Ghafoor. How does one avoid conflict of interest in the South China Sea? I think that's what he means. The third is from Anshu Kumar, and that's the third question, the last one. Do you think that the triumph of the potential triumph, I suppose, of Joe Biden in the next presidential elections in the US will sway the Indo-US relationship, will impact on the India-US relationship? How shall we distribute it? Frankly, I'll run through the entire panel and you can reflect very quickly on all the 3 points. So I take it that each of the panelists speakers has also seen these. You heard from me the questions, and if you want to once again take a look, please just open the Q&A box so that you can see that once again. And I will run through the panel and request you to reflect on all 3. Whereafter I will just make a few closing remarks to bring this wonderful event to an end. So let me begin with, again, with Admiral Anup Singh. The floor is yours. Admiral Anup Singh, would you please care to reflect on the 3 questions that have been raised in the Q&A box?
Once again, I had made the mistake of not unmuting myself. Am I audible
Never
right
mind.
now?
Please
Okay.
go ahead.
So far as the first question by Anshu Kumar is concerned, of rejuvenation of the Quad as becoming antagonistic to the non-alignment policy, I think in today's day and age, at that time, non-alignment was all right for India, and going back to the Afro-Asian conference in Bandung, followed by whatever happened thereafter, we were perfectly fine in trying to say that, look, the Cold War, we don't get involved, and we are not allies on one side or the other. Even today, when we talk of the Quad, we are very clear. We are not into an alliance. It is, you could call it, colloquially call it, a coalition of the willing. And what was the foundation of the Quad as proposed by then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe? It was in the aftermath of the tsunami, the terrible Asian tsunami that happened in 2004, that he proposed that these 4 major powers who are resident in the Indo-Pacific should come together to take charge of situations of that nature, particularly natural disasters, and of course, to keep the peace in case of any man-made disaster. I mean, the later part was unsaid. So it doesn't really make any difference today. In any case, non-alignment policy of that time is a damp squib today. However, we still say we are not into alliance. We love strategic autonomy, and everybody else around us respects that. How to avoid conflict is the second question by Mr. Abdul Ghaffur. In the South Sea Pacific, obviously, as Ambassador Chinoy said, you must be meaning South China Sea. Now, strictly speaking, China would get into conflict at its own peril, and it knows it, but it has the military might and it feels strategic heft in the whole of the West Pacific, the Western Pacific region, and therefore it does nitpicking. It has harnessed the mantle of aggressive behavior and coercive attitude since 2009, when it first said that the 9-dash line is to be respected by all. Insofar as conflict by us, if at all you are meaning, we are not a resident power in the Pacific, so the question doesn't arise. And we are not into provocations anywhere. However, the South China Sea, please remember, has as much as $190 to $220 billion worth of Indian trade out of a total of almost $800 billion across the world, belonging to India, whether imports or exports, which passes year after year. We have a lot of interests in the Pacific. As I highlighted earlier, some of our hydrocarbon assets have been acquired or leased from various countries in that area. And particularly critical are the JVs. Since 1988, many people are not aware of it. In Vietnam's EEZ. So we are very clear. And on one odd occasion in 2011, the Chinese tried to say to an Indian warship that you are in Chinese territorial waters. And the ship said, identify yourself. And thereafter, there was complete radio silence. So, you know, I always say that China understands the taste of its own medicine. And that's what we have been practicing. And that's what we will continue to. And so far as the last question by Anshu Kumar is concerned, do you think the triumph of Joe Biden in the next presidential election will sway the Indo-US relationship? Well, strictly speaking, Indo-US relations were predicted to be not as warm in the current president's tenure. But you are seeing that we have come together because of important questions in which the transition from president to president does not really affect so much. So it is not going to be swing up or down because after all, the State Department, the Pentagon, they have their say, and the American establishment understands where their interests lie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral Anup Singh. May I now turn to the next speaker to give his brief comments on these three questions. Commodore Anil Jai Singh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll be very brief. I think Admiral Anup Singh has already given a fairly comprehensive overview, and I don't think we have anything very much more to say. But as far as the first question is concerned, I think firstly, India is committed to strategic autonomy. So I don't think there is any question of an alliance. Well, not in the near future, unless circumstances over the next few years force us into doing something like that. Of course, non-alignment is a thing of the past. We're talking now strategic autonomy. And rejuvenating the Quad doesn't necessarily mean that there will be an alliance. There are many ways of coming around it. It can be a partnership, it can be an alignment. But I think the four countries have to, or if it becomes Quad plus more countries, 4 plus more, will have to work out an informal mechanism in which interoperability, etc., would figure prominently. And I don't think the Quad is actually looking at conflict. So it will not be a military alliance, or I don't think it will ever grow into a military alliance, but it will certainly look at maintaining the freedom of trade and freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific, what we call a free and open Indo-Pacific, and the rules-based international order as seen by the Western democracies and India, like-minded nations. with Europe also coming in now, it's going to be a much larger framework in which this whole thing will work. As far as avoiding conflict, I agree with Admiral Anup Singh. India would not enter into a conflict in the South China Sea unless any of its maritime interests are threatened or compromised. India is committed to protecting its maritime interests anywhere in the world. The Navy is structured like that. It's one of the Navy's major roles. And we will not allow any of our assets to be threatened or any of our interests to be compromised. Other than that, India, I don't think would venture into the South China Sea to initiate a conflict with China. As far as the triumph of Joe Biden next presidential election is concerned, I think the Indo-US relationship has reached a point where there may be minor tweaks here and there, but fundamentally, India is important to the US in the Indo-Pacific and vice versa. So I don't think there will be much change. As an opposition leader, he may have said certain things which give the impression that he may not be not be as warm to India. But even we saw even in President Trump's time, while the depth of the strategic relationship was evident, but there were issues which still caused a little bit of friction here and there. So that will continue in any bilateral relationship, I think, that is there. It's a multi-sectoral, multi-layered, multi-dimensional relationship. So everything can't be absolutely 100% hunky-dory, but I think broadly there will be no major change in the Indo-US relationship. If anything, it will get closer and not more distant. That's all I have to say on that.
Thank you very much for those additional remarks that you just made.